This episode is brought to you by Progressive Insurance. Fiscally responsible, financial geniuses, monetary magicians. These are things people say about drivers who switch their car insurance to Progressive and save hundreds. Visit progressive.com to see if you could save. Progressive Casualty Insurance Company and Affiliates. Potential savings will vary, not available in all states or situations.
16 years from today, Greg Gerstner will finally land the perfect cannonball. Epic splash. Unsuspecting friends. A work of art only possible because Greg is already meeting all these same people at AARP volunteer and community events that keep him active and involved and help make sure his happiness lives as long as he does. That's why the younger you are, the more you need AARP. Learn more at aarp.org/local.
Atheists, agnostics, long-haired weirdos, short-haired weirdos, vandals, hooligans.
The government, hug the government, love the government, hug the government, love the government, hug the government.
Welcome to The Politics Guys, a place for bipartisan, rational, and civil debate on American politics and policy. I'm Northern Kentucky University political scientist Michael Baranowski. My guest today is Paul Starr, professor of sociology and public affairs at Princeton University and the author of multiple books, including the Pulitzer Prize-winning The Social Transformation of American Medicine. I have been a huge fan of his work for my entire academic career, and so it's really an honor for me to have the opportunity to talk with him about his latest book, American Contradiction, Revolution and Revenge from the 90s to Now. Paul Starr, welcome to the show.
Glad to be with you, Mike.
So I always like to start with titles, as listeners know, and the title of your book, American Contradiction. So why contradiction?
That title works two ways. So first, you mentioned the subtitle, Revolution and Revenge from the 1950s to Now. And the first half of the book is called American Revolutions of the 20th Century, by which I mean the rights revolution, the revolution in racial and gender relations. And then the second half of the book is called Sleepwalking into Revenge. And it is about all the ways in which that those changes from the mid-20th century on have been undone, nullified, reversed, contradicted. It's kind of the contradiction of the America of Obama versus the America of Trump. That's one way to read the title. But I also have a more fundamental argument in the book, and that goes to the very founding of the country and the argument that the United States was founded in the contradiction between freedom and racial slavery. And this was not just a matter, let's say, of hypocrisy or a paradox about the United States. It was really quite fundamental. Really two different kinds of society developed in the early republic in the United States. One society based on slave labor and the other society based on free labor. These were very different Americas. And eventually, in the Civil War, they went to war with each other. That didn't wholly resolve the basic issues. Continued under Jim Crow, we've had, in a sense, descendants of that founding contradiction all the way through. And I see it's not just a matter of race, though. I think in fact, I use the term racial reductionism in my book. I don't think you can reduce everything to race in America now at all. But that initial conflict became a wider conflict with the egalitarian movements of the mid-20th century and the movements that sought equality for women, that sought equality for gays and lesbians and so forth. This became a bigger struggle over freedom versus social subordination. And that's kind of what I mean is this ongoing rift that, has continued throughout our history, and it erupts in different ways. In the preface to the book, I suggest this, there's this old image, America as a city on a hill, something I come back to a couple of times later on. And I would say, well, you could also say America was a city built on a geological fault. It had this, right from the start. And we keep fighting over this in different ways. That's the other meaning for American contradiction.
Also, early on in the book, you write about America being a new people in an old nation. I was hoping you could talk about what you mean by that and why it's important to understand politics today.
Right. So these two terms, people and nation, might be seen as indistinguishable, and in some circumstances they are. But what I'm arguing in this book is that since the mid-20th century, there's been more change in the American people than there has been in the American nation. And so what I mean by, well, those changes in the American people have come from new ideas about identity and rights, new infusions of immigrants, changes among younger generations, I think especially among women. And that has really changed the American people. Not everybody, but it's changed. And to some extent, of course, I think it's actually changed the people who were not included in this because they, in some way, may feel excluded or feel in conflict with these changes taking place. But as a nation, the United States is very little changed. So by that, I mean, we have this 18th century Constitution. It's very hard to amend. Our political institutions have been very little changed over the years. We still have the same two-party system. The fundamental aspects of the economy are unchanged. The symbols of the nation have remained the same. And so you have this change that's happened among the people and very little change in the nation and its institutions and its symbols. And this has become wrapped up in the conflict in the sense that the people who are most nervous about these other changes, about the changes in rights and identity and race and gender and so forth, they've latched onto the nation. They have seized the nation as theirs. It's their heritage, fighting against this change in the people. That's the idea. And we've got these institutions that are, really entrenched in a way. It's very hard to change our Constitution, a two-party system. They continue, and so there's this fundamental conflict. That's the argument there.
I've been making that point for a long time, and I often thought I should write a book about that. Now you've relieved me of that responsibility, having written about that far better than I could. So thank you. On looking back, which a lot of our politics seems to do these days, especially on the right, there's this idea that of the 1950s as being this wonderful era. I mean, when Trump and Trumpists say, make America great again, I think the America a lot of them think about is the America of the 1950s. And there's this vision of it as this time of everything was peaceful and happy and consensus and all that. But you argue in the book that that's not really the case, right?
I do think that the 1950s is kind of a political litmus test. So there was a survey that asked people, do you think the changes since the 1950s have been for the better or for the worse? 2/3 of Republicans said the changes have been for the worse. 2/3 of Democrats said the changes have been for the better. So yes, very different views of the 1950s. And I do call it an era of peak consensus. That is between the more overtly divided and 1960s. So there was a kind of consensus maintained on television, for example, between the two parties in Washington that agreed on many matters of foreign policy and so forth, that often socialized with each other. There wasn't the level of hostility that you have today. There was a kind of culture of consensus. So I cite, for example, a speech given by the president of NBC News about how it was the president of NBC who said it was the obligation of the networks to stay within, his phrase was, the area of American agreement. And I think that kind of captured a certain idea, but it didn't really mean that there was full agreement. So, there was no consensus between blacks and whites about racial integration. There was no consensus really between unions and companies about workers' pay. This was actually the peak era of unionization in the United States. There were a lot of strikes. Whole industries were shut down periodically. We don't have this anymore. So in many ways, there wasn't really a consensus, but there was an aura of consensus, a kind of official public consensus.
To me, I guess when I think about it, and maybe this kind of gives a sense of where I am on the spectrum, is that it was an era of sort of a stultifying conformity with fake consensus that was driven by people knowing their place, as the phrase used to be. And to me, that's not a real consensus. And it sounds like your argument as well, in part.
Yeah. I would say this also, because I say that, that era was stultifying in the way you describe it, but in some ways it was also admirable. And so I mentioned, for example, that the 1950s was a very child-oriented era. Of course, we had a high birth rate, but we built schools. We did all kinds of things to improve public education. There was a good side to the 50s. I am a child of the 1950s, and there were many things. I think people who grew up then, later, many of them retained positive memories of that time, and there were all kinds of troubles that followed later. And so there is this nostalgia for the 50s, as well as the concerns that you mentioned about its being restrictive.
And I think starting in the 50s, we see the emergence of the civil rights movement, which you talk about. But you describe it in the book. You say that the civil rights movement was sort of a prototype for other liberation struggles. And I'm wondering, what sort of lessons of that movement did other groups who were working toward equal rights sort of pick up on and try to carry forward in their own struggles?
Right. So, yes, this is very much the argument of the book. In fact, the second chapter has what may seem to many people a paradoxical title, Black Americans, Model Minority. And I mentioned at the beginning of that chapter that actually there were two model minorities in the 1950s and 60s. And the first was actually Japanese Americans. And it's one of the things I really only discovered in going back and doing a lot of reading, that, first of all, even the category Asian Americans didn't exist at that point. There weren't large numbers of Asian immigrants. But during World War II, the Japanese had been interned on the West Coast in concentration camps. They had been treated as an enemy race. And yet, by the mid-50s, early 60s, sociologists were writing about the extraordinary progress that Japanese Americans had been making since World War II, even though many of them had been expropriated, they had lost their property, and they had nonetheless recovered. And they were gaining educationally and doing very, very well. And some people said, this is really encouraging. It's an example of American redemption. And it shows we can do the same with Black Americans. So it's interesting to go back and read that and see that they took a positive lesson from it. The Black movement that emerged in the 1950s and 60s, most notably with Martin Luther King and the Freedom Rides and other marches, that became a model in another way, a model of collective struggle, as opposed to individual advancement through education and so forth. And I actually go back and I refer more broadly to the Black freedom struggle, of which the civil rights movement was one phase. And there were actually a series of prototypes that other movements later picked up on. So one of those was civil rights litigation, which was the initial approach of the NAACP, and sought to establish legal precedents, go to the Supreme Court. This began in the 1920s and 30s. There was another phase, which is sometimes called civil rights unionism within the labor unions, civil rights efforts. And then the nonviolent direct action movement that Martin Luther King and others led, that was another phase. That's the one we think of as the civil rights movement. And then finally, there was the phase of Black power. And my argument is that each of these had some influence, more or less, on other ethnic groups, later on Hispanics, on Asian Americans, on Native Americans, then on the women's movement, on the gay and lesbian movement. There were even particular individuals who were initially involved in the Black struggle and then got involved in these other movements. And they carried the ideas with them. And so to take, a very clear example of this, the legal claims made by the Black movement that resulted in court decisions that resulted in the Civil Rights Act of 1964, the Voting Rights Act in 1965. Those laws were written in more general terms, and they became a basis for the legal claims then made by other groups. And there's a very interesting here way in which, for example, it passed over into the women's movement. So before 1964, there actually was no agitation to include sex discrimination in the Civil Rights Act. And I tell a story there about how that happened, which I think many people would find very surprising. So instead of there being protesters demanding reference to sex discrimination, the whole thing came up on the floor of the House of Representatives. The original bill had no mention of discrimination by sex or gender. There's nothing in it. And Southern segregationists, influential member of the House, Howard Smith, proposed an amendment to include sex discrimination as one of the prohibited grounds of employment discrimination. And Howard Smith did not have the best intentions in mind for the Civil Rights Act. He wanted to defeat the whole thing. So it's clear he was up to tricks. And even the way he introduced his amendment, he said that he had a letter from a constituent, a woman who complained that women didn't have an equal chance to get a husband because there weren't enough men. And the House erupted in laughter and so forth. I mean, this was not, but at first, the Johnson administration opposed this amendment. And one leading woman in the House, Edith Green, spoke against it, thinking it was a poison pill intended to sink the whole bill. But then some other women in the House said, this would be a good idea. We should do this. And so this amendment passed with the support of Southern segregationists and some liberal Democrats. And then, of course, the Southern segregationists voted against the bill as a whole. So, we got this into the Civil Rights Act before there was really any women's movement to demand it. But once it was in the law, it began to stimulate activity, lawsuits and protests. Well, carry this out. And so we really get the movement after the law instead of having the movement before the law in that case. So that's an example of how the Black struggle spilled over and affected the
when I think about progress on minority rights, on women's rights, on LGBTQ rights, it seems to me that, there were a lot of struggles, but the path has been a really positive one from my perspective, and I think from those groups' perspective. And it seemed to me with the most recent thing, obviously, being gay rights. And there, it seemed to me that the victory in quotes, was really impressive and impressively quick. And I remember Barack Obama not coming out in favor of same-sex marriage. And nowadays, that's just impossible to imagine from a mainstream Democrat. But there's been a big change recently. As recently as 2022, over half of all Republicans supported same-sex marriage. But in the last 3 years, that has dropped a lot. I saw a May 2025 Gallup poll that puts Republican support for same-sex marriage at just 41% compared to 76% of independents and 88% of Democrats. That's a big change in a very short period of time. And I'm wondering, what do you think might be responsible for this significant, it seems to me to be a significant shift if it holds from Republicans?
I'm not sure what to make of it. So on the one hand, I wouldn't be surprised if Republicans backed off support for same-sex marriage. That has happened with some other things that Republicans had previously supported. This is actually an important sub-theme in the book that, for example, a higher proportion of Republicans voted for that 1964 Civil Rights Act than Democrats. Republicans were initially slightly more likely to support Roe v. Wade than Democrats. Many of the changes that took place in the 1960s and 70s had a great deal of Republican support. And then what happened in later decades is that Republicans backed off a lot of these things. So what you're describing could be another aspect of this. But I'm struck more right now by the prominence of gay men in the Trump administration. I would not have expected that Trump's Secretary of the Treasury would be a gay man who is married to another man. We have, the New York Times had a fascinating article a couple of weeks ago about the Secretary of the Navy and other high-level officials in the Trump administration who are gay. And, I don't think we saw this in any previous Republican administration, not Trump one. So to me, that is a sign of acceptance. I mean, in fact, if you had asked me years ago, which was more likely to survive in the long run, that is, would it be abortion rights or the rights of LGBTQ people? I would have said, well, abortion rights are much more likely to survive. And it's turned out just the opposite way. It looks at the moment where the courts have reversed Roe v. Wade. The Supreme Court has reversed Roe v. Wade. But at this point, it hasn't yet reversed the decisions, the whole series of decisions that began with Lawrence in 2003, Lawrence v. Texas, and all the way up to Bostock in 2022. This whole series of decisions that really Anthony Kennedy was primarily responsible for, Justice Kennedy. Those, they may get undone. Certainly, we know that Clarence Thomas wants to reverse them, but that may not. In the 2022 case, Bostock, which was about employment discrimination on the basis of sexual orientation and gender identity, that had both Chief Justice Roberts and Gorsuch, and Justice Gorsuch. So it had two Republicans siding with the liberals in that case. I think it's turned out in a very unexpected way, compared again to what you might have thought really, as recently as the early 2000s.
I guess why I was thinking about that question, it gets into, at least in my mind, what you call the total revenge of Trumpism. And I guess I'm thinking that maybe there's just too much too quickly. And finally, a lot of MAGA supporters who are less inclined to support, say, LGBTQ rights than maybe Donald Trump is personally, that they just said enough is enough. And we just want to go back. This is just too much, and we're going to kind of go back on that. But I guess before we get into that, maybe you could talk a little about why you see Trumpism as total revenge and sort of how that differs from the approach of, more recent or previous Republican presidents like Reagan and the Bushes.
Right. So going back to the book, I mentioned the first half is called American Revolutions of the 20th Century, and it's there that I talk about the changes that have taken place as a result of the Black movement and the women's movement and the LGBTQ movement and so forth. And that half of the book ends with a chapter called Half a Counter-Revolution. And by that, I'm mainly referring to Reagan. It actually covers from Nixon through Reagan. And the argument is that although those Republican presidents often won the presidency, campaigning against the changes that had taken place, and often courting the forces of backlash against those changes. In office, they didn't really mount a full counter-revolution. And the justices that they appointed to the Supreme Court did not either. There were ways in which the earlier decisions got modified, but, for example, affirmative action held up in that period, various other things. It was only half a counter-revolution. And it was particularly a reversal of the policies toward unions and taxes. And so there's a big shift in taxes with Reagan. And beginning with Reagan's firing of the air traffic controllers, there was a considerable effort by American business to decertify unions, to roll back the union power and so forth. So in that way, there was definitely, it wasn't as though there was no change. There was some significant change, but in fact, most of the key precedents from the Warren Court in the 1950s and 60s, most of those precedents held up through that period. But what's happening now is much more like a full counter-revolution. And I mean it not only by Trump, but also by the Roberts Court. There's a much more fundamental effort to reverse, to undo the things that had changed in that period. So in that sense, I think it's more, and so it's not just that Trump is, attempting to reverse immigration policies. It goes on to almost every aspect of national policy.
I think that term you use, counter-revolution, is a really important one, because when I talk to my friends on the right about this sort of thing, they say, well, no, what's happening now isn't radical. It is a return to a sort of normalcy after the radicalism of the Warren Court and the 60s and the 70s and so forth. So we're not the revolutionaries. You guys are, and you just push too far too fast.
Well, I understand that point of view. I would say that a lot of these changes that took place as a result of those social movements and the court decisions, those became integrated into American life. That became normal for many people. So now undoing it is a big, I think counter-revolution is the right way to frame it.
Oh, yeah, definitely. So let's move into the 90s, because it seems to me that we started to really see, and in the book you talk about the 90s and the culture war and so forth. And what was it about the 90s and not previous eras that all of this kind of came into, where it started to feel for the first time like that liberals weren't just the other side, the loyal opposition, but they were the enemy? And I remember as a young fire-eating conservative back in 1990s, back when I was conservative, that's sure how I felt. And I'm wondering what was going on there. Not with me personally, obviously.
Right. So this is the era, when the Cold War ends. And you might have thought that given how important military and foreign policy disputes were to national politics, you might have thought there'd be an era of good feeling. And all those divisions over the Cold War were now irrelevant. And yet that's not what happened. To some extent, I think the energies that had gone into fighting the Cold War now went into fighting a culture war. And that was, I think, very explicit. I have this quote from Irving Kristol, neoconservative, at the very beginning of that chapter. Now that the Cold War is over, the real Cold War can begin. You get that, I think, clearly from Patrick Buchanan's speech to the 1992 Republican Convention. But then I think there's another aspect to this, and this has more to do with Newt Gingrich and the strategy that congressional Republicans followed. And here I'm very much influenced by a book by my colleague at Princeton, political scientist Frances Lee, a book called Insecure Majorities. And what she emphasizes is how close the two parties were in this period. And so she says, when it's clear who's going to be in control of a chamber of the House, the minority members don't expect to be able to win control. And each of them individually may try to get something for their constituents into a bill. And they emphasize sort of quiet negotiation. They're more cooperative with the majority because there's no chance they're going to be able to gain power. But when the majorities are insecure, when there's a chance that the minority can become the majority, then the strategic incentive is to shift from winning little legislative victories to emphasizing divisions, cultivating solidarity against the majority and taking the fight in the most visible way to the public. And that was Gingrich's strategy, combative. And so there's this kind of logic to what Gingrich was doing, and in fact, it worked. So the very fact that it worked led others to follow in that vein. So I think it's, to some extent, it's completely counterintuitive. You have the end of the Cold War. Shouldn't there be more amicable relations? And exactly the reverse happens.
This is also the era when we start to see conservative media be really big. And I remember as a young conservative back then that it was thrilling for me because I finally felt like there were outlets that were talking about things and ideas that resonated with me that I wasn't getting from, say, the Washington Post or the Nightly News or something like that. But yet, I think in general on the left, the rise of conservative media is seen as a pretty bad thing. So how do you see how conservative media, the role it's played, how it's fit into all this has been happening since the 90s?
I think it's a hugely important development, perhaps even a precondition for many of the political changes that have taken place. And yeah, so of course there were conservative media, all along. There were, publications like Human Events and National Review, and there were radio stations across the country. Salem Radio was the big company that had a lot of the Christian radio stations and other conservative radio stations. But what conservatives did lack for many years were the kinds of national media that could report the news the way they understood the world, and that could provide platforms for conservative hosts with national reach, and that had major resources. So, there was a big shift in conservative media going from the margins into the center, in the center of media influence and power, and really challenging the existing media elites in New York and Hollywood. So I understand that was a huge thing, and there have been a lot of attempts to map the new media ecosystems. That's a term a lot of people use. And what you see in some of these studies is that, and you can look, for example, at which publications or websites or broadcast sites are linked to each other, who refers to each other. And then you can also follow what gets tweeted, what gets posted, what gets reposted, and so forth, and map this all out. There's a lot of big data going into this. And what you see is that there's one universe that extends kind of from the center right, like the Wall Street Journal, through the New York Times, and even further to the left, and then another separate ecosystem on the right, Fox News and all the others there. And so we now have, it's characteristic of this highly polarized political world, that we get these two different media ecosystems that have emerged. And what you worry about is Americans not agreeing on certain basic facts. So there's this old phrase, this line, Daniel Patrick Moynihan, you're entitled to your own opinion, but not your own facts. And it used to be that we had some agreement about facts. Now we don't even have the agreement about facts. And that is a huge problem.
For years, I remember starting, I think, in the 90s, or maybe a little later on, once I kind of shifted over to the center left, I kept on hearing from all sorts of folks, supposedly wiser than I, saying, don't worry, things seem bad now, but we are the emerging Democratic majority. Demographics is destiny, and it's all going to kind of happen for us. You just have to wait for this a little bit. But now we've seen minorities increasingly abandoning the Democratic Party, and it looks like demographics is not going to be destiny. Oh, what do you think's going on here?
Okay, so first of all, those demographic projections were misleading.
Yeah.
I have a lot about that in the book. I've written a lot about this. I was much influenced by a book by the late sociologist Richard Alba, a book called The Great Demographic Illusion. And what Alba shows in that book is that the much cited census projections were really quite misleading. So now let me just go for a little moment into, it's not that technical a matter, but the U.S. Census in 2000, 2010 asked two different questions. So one question is, what is your race? And those options included, white, black, Native American, and the 8 different Asian ethnicities. And then there's a separate question, are you of Hispanic or Latino descent? And the census would then report two different numbers. So one number had to do with its projections of the white population, and another had to do with its projections of the minority population. And in the minority population, the census included all Hispanics. But actually, half of Hispanics were self-identifying as white. Now, when you looked at these two projections, the projection of the white population hardly changed in the future. The census was clearly saying there will continue to be a large white majority, 75%, up to mid-20s, 21st century. But the minority population, it was projecting to grow, and at various points said like 2042, there'd be a crossover point, and there would be more minority than white people. That got picked up, and the headlines said, often said whites will become a minority, even though that's not actually what the census found. But there was even a problem with that data. So in 2000, for the first time, the federal government allowed people to check off more than one race. You could say white and black. You could say white and Asian or whatever. But when tabulating these numbers, the census decided that anybody who checked off two and one of those included a minority would be classified as minority. Now, and then they projected that then into the future. And we have increasing rates of intermarriage. And we have sociological studies that indicate, with a child with white and Asian parents, actually the majority of them self-identify as white. But the census didn't recognize that. And whenever they projected, mathematically, they projected the number of interracial marriage, they assumed that the children and their children forever after would self-identify as minority. And the result is to overproject the minority population. In fact, what happens, we know, the term for this in sociology is ethnic attrition. We know, for example, that there are many people of Latin American descent in the United States who don't identify as Latino. What's happened over the generations is that they've intermarried with non-Latinos. And, maybe there was a great-grandfather who came from Latin America, and maybe in Latin America, I have relatives who came from Eastern Europe and went to Colombia and Venezuela, went to Caracas, and then they moved to the United States in the next generation. I mean, there are lots of people of European descent in Latin America, and the fact that they come from Latin America doesn't mean that their descendants in the U.S. are going to think of themselves as Latino. So you get this overprojection. It got much worse into the 2020 census. I have a whole separate article about this, about the massive misrepresentation in census data of how people actually self-identify. Just to give you the most incredible example, under white, for the first time, the census asked you to print origins. And if you printed an origin that wasn't European, you were classified as non-white. So let us take somebody named Elon Musk. Might well have put down as an origin South Africa. That's where he came from. But if he did that, the census would have actually classified him as minority, which would give Elon Musk, I'm sure, quite a laugh.
I think a lot of times on the left, we assume that if someone is anti-immigration, because immigration plays a big role in your book, that if you're anti-immigration, you're either some sort of a blockhead nativist or you're a racist or some combination thereof. But I think there's an argument on the right where they say, well, too much immigration and it's not controlled well enough. That really works against kind of a shared national identity and national culture that a country really needs to be united and to be strong. And I'm wondering what you think about that argument.
So there may be, I don't know that we could estimate this, but there may be some threshold, some limit of tolerance for the level of immigration. We've seen the growth of opposition to immigration at a time when the foreign-born population in the United States has reached and actually now a bit surpassed the level that it did just before the immigration restriction of the 90s. So in a way, it is a kind of a repeat of what happened earlier in American history when the level of immigration did get very high. There was a reaction against it. We've had repeated anti-immigration movements really going back to the opposition to the Irish in the 1840s and 50s and 60s. I mean, it's not, the first time this has happened in the country. And what I say in the book is that if you believe immigration is a good thing, and I think it has been a good thing for the United States, it's enriched American culture, it's had economic benefits to the country. But if you believe that, you have to take seriously the concerns of people who think immigration is not a good thing for them. And there certainly are reasons people could think that have nothing to do with racism. They might believe that there's a limited amount of housing or a limited number of jobs, and they could be concerned that immigrants, especially immigrants from poor countries, will be a draw on the public budget and will. So I don't think we should believe that all concern about immigration originates with. And I think there's a separate issue that has to do with border security. And so I'm very critical of what happened under Biden. And I think one of the things you do have to reassure the public about in regard to immigration is that it's under control, that we have some reasonable belief about the people coming in and that we check them out, that, and so forth, and that the numbers, again, are reasonable. And I think really Biden made a number of mistakes. One of the things I point out in the book is that when he came into office in 2021, the polls, actually, the Gallup poll, Gallup had been asking the same questions since 1965. Every year, they asked the same questions about immigration. And one of those questions is, do you think immigration is a good thing or a bad thing? And another question is, do you think immigration should be increased or decreased? And the public in 2020 and 21 was actually very positive about immigration, probably in reaction against Trump. And in fact, those 2 years, 2020 and 21, were the only 2 years when Gallup found more people wanted to increase immigration than decrease it. So actually, Biden had a moment of very considerable goodwill toward immigration, and he squandered it. He squandered it with policies that led people to totally reverse their view about immigration. We see that in the surveys in Gallup and elsewhere.
What's going on? I'm Arch Manning, Viore athlete and college quarterback. Whether I'm running, training, traveling, or just unwinding at home, I love doing it in my core shorts from Viore. With a breathable boxer brief liner, they're quick to dry, super versatile, and stand up to even my most intense training sessions. Plus, they come in 3 inseams and a ton of colors. Ready to try a pair? Go to viore.com/arch and get 20% off at checkout. I think you're going to love them as much as I do. That's viore.com/ARCH and get 20% off your first order. Exclusions apply. Visit the website for full terms and conditions. Not only will you receive 20% off your first purchase, but enjoy free shipping on any U.S. orders over $75 and free returns. Have a great day.
I think one common view of kind of what's been happening lately in politics or over the last decade or two is that the Democratic Party, which used to be known of as the party of the working person, right, very strongly for that sort of thing, sort of abandoned that and kind of went full into culture wars and these sort of liberation struggles. And you kind of expect that for Republicans, but in a weird twist, now it seems like the Republicans somehow are the party of the working person in some weird way. I mean, what do you make of this kind of strange juxtapositioning?
Yeah, so I think Democrats failed to come through for a lot of working people on issues that were of concern to them. And so this is complicated. Talk about the free trade agreements that Clinton supported, NAFTA, and the opening to those did have significant effects on manufacturing jobs. In the case of NAFTA, it was mostly on Southern workers and, particular industries like textiles and others. And in the case of China, it was much bigger. The China shock hit manufacturing, particularly in the Midwest. And those were areas where Democrats lost support from white workers very substantially, and that had huge political consequences. Well, one of the things I taught in regard to the South, many people say, well, Democrats lost the South because of the Civil Rights Act. And there's this famous quote from Lyndon Johnson, saying, well, there goes the South, when he signs the legislation, one of the civil rights bills. But in fact, Democrats were competitive in the South for the next 30 years. That's how Jimmy Carter got elected governor of Georgia. Bill Clinton got elected governor of Arkansas. Democrats were competitive through most of the South in those 30 years. Democrats really only lost the South for good in the 90s. And I think NAFTA had something to do with it. There are lots of other things going on as well. And then, the same thing effectively happened in the Midwest in states like Ohio. And so there is a way in which I think many white workers saw the Democrats as abandoning them. And that is, that's something that some Democrats have fought against. They've tried to earn trust back, but there's a problem.
Along those lines, I think you can maybe make a case that the greatest presidential miscalculation, I guess, of the post-war era is the Clinton administration pushing so hard to let China into the international economic order with basically no kind of constraints, no kind of deals, and just assuming that, well, once they economically liberalized, they would politically liberalize and they wouldn't steal hundreds of billions in intellectual property and all the other problems that I think are kind of bleed into not just economics, but cultural issues as well.
Yeah, it was a disastrous choice.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, let's talk about the judiciary a little bit, because in the book, you talk a bit about the conservative judicial movement, and you've already mentioned the Roberts Court. When we think about, at least when I think about the conservative judicial movement, I think about the Federalist Society. So can you talk a little bit about how important the Federalist Society has been in advancing the conservative judicial movement?
I think you've got to say it's been one of the most successful movements in American history in changing American institutions. Absolutely. And has had a huge impact on the courts. So I do have a chapter in the book about the counter-revolution through the courts. One thing to emphasize is how much this involved a change within the Republican Party, a change within the Republican nominated justices. So we have actually never had, or not yet, not had a Democratic appointed Chief Justice since 1952. Every Chief Justice since then has been a Republican. But the first of those Republican justices, Earl Warren, was a liberal and reflected a lot of the Republican Party these days. I mean, he was nominated by President Eisenhower, and he had been the 3 times elected governor of California and the Republican vice presidential candidate 1948. He was a very popular Republican. He did represent an important strand of the Republican Party that was in favor of civil rights and of equal rights for women and so forth. So this is, since January 1972, Republican nominated justices have had a majority of the court. There's only one period after Justice Scalia died for about a year when the court was tied 4-4. But throughout this period, Republicans have had a majority of the court. But it's been a shift from liberal to moderate Republicans to much more conservative Republicans. And yes, the conservative legal movement is responsible for this shift, for organizing within law schools and elsewhere to project an alternative view. And I think, I have to hats off, acknowledge they succeeded in what they were trying to do.
I think a lot of folks, and I've talked to a number of folks who are Federalist Society members, and I think their view is along the lines of, well, we didn't have anything, kind of like, I guess, with the media saying that, well, there was a liberal legal organization. We call it the American Bar Association. And so basically we had to create our own counter institutions. And I think this is kind of a theme in general in conservatism in the 90s and after, is that the recognition or the belief that they needed to create their own separate conservative counter institutions to address the complete imbalance of the elites on the left that have come to dominate all those institutions. And we're seeing that now in a way, kind of with education, I think higher ed with Trump versus the Ivies kind of thing.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right about the scope of the conflict that has evolved. I just want to say one more thing. So in this discussion I have in the book about the legal counter-revolution, I have a whole discussion of what I call the quiet phase of the counter-revolution, and a lot of changes that didn't get a lot of attention at the time. For example, changes that allowed companies to impose private arbitration on workers and consumers. So you can't go to court if you believe you have been injured in various ways. Your rights have been violated. This has effectively undone a great deal of the rights revolution from the mid-20th century. The limitation on class action bans, which prevent many people who have suffered losses, like from credit card companies and so forth. They can't get together and through a class action, try to vindicate their rights. So we've had that kind of quiet phase, which I believe is extremely significant and hasn't had enough attention. Then there's the noisier phase, the things that people are aware of, like the reversal of Roe v. Wade. And then the final part of that discussion has to do, which I call the partisan court, has to do with Supreme Court decisions on matters of great and clear electoral consequence. And I particularly highlight three decisions: Bush v. Gore, which decided the 2000 election; Shelby County v. Holder, which undid part of the Voting Rights Amendment; and then Trump v. United States. In 2024, that's the presidential immunity case. And what I argue is you look at each of these cases, and they weren't decided on the basis of originalist doctrine. I mean, just think about the immunity decision. There's nothing about presidential immunity in the text of the Constitution. There's really nothing in the history and tradition of that time that supports presidential immunity. These were mostly ad hoc decisions with enormous partisan consequences. And this is where I think the court is really, again, it's acting in a highly partisan way. I think it's now making a whole series of decisions in favor of Trump that are inconsistent with doctrines that the conservatives on the court have previously enunciated. I could go through a whole series of these, and I think this is going to bring a reaction eventually. The Democrats are just going to have to face up to the fact that they can't live under this kind of a regime that the Supreme Court is imposing, where it says one thing to a Democratic president and another thing to Trump.
So it sounds like you're maybe in agreement with the dissent. I believe Justice Jackson wrote not too long ago, saying that it seems like with this court, it's playing by the rules of Calvin ball, which there are no rules except for that the administration wins, basically.
Yeah.
Well, that is not exactly a very happy sort of thing, but. And certainly right now, as a Democrat, I'm not feeling very positive. I see very fractured opposition. I see public sentiment of Democrats at its lowest in 30 years. Voter registration is not going our way. We don't seem to have come up with a compelling counter narrative to MAGA. And we have more than 3 years, hard to believe, of Donald Trump and almost certainly a Republican-controlled Senate, which means basically whoever he wants to appoint is almost certainly going to be rubber-stamped right in. Because honestly, if you vote to confirm RFK Jr., you're going to vote to confirm pretty much anyone. So obviously, I'm not feeling very optimistic. I'm hoping, I always like to try to close on at least a semi-optimistic note. So please, if you can give me some reason to feel optimistic, that would be awesome.
Well, okay. So, Mike, when I look over the last several decades, the elections that we've had have been extremely close. Two of them decided by the Electoral College, 2000 and 2016. And even this last election, in the popular vote, Trump's edge was 1.4. You look at this historically, the parties have been very, very close in presidential elections and congressional elections. It has been, and this is a phrase I use in a new piece in the American Prospect, this has been a tie game that Democrats have been losing. Yeah. So when they've won elections, they really haven't been able to accomplish that much. They lost the Congress almost immediately at the midterms. But when Republicans win, they've been able to move ahead, as Trump is moving ahead, very aggressively, in part because of the Supreme Court allowing a lot of these actions. So Democrats have to get back their nerve. I don't think they're that far from getting back majorities. And I wouldn't pay that much attention to what the polls say at the moment. I think the 2026 elections will be a better signal. And I think there's a vacuum of leadership right now in the Democratic Party. There's no single person who really is articulating for the country what Democrats stand for. So I think a lot of people are confused about what the party is, what it offers. And I think that will get cleared up. I'm not too worried about that. What I am worried about is the degree to which the Supreme Court will allow the Trump administration to entrench itself in power. I worry about people's actual ability to vote, and the other changes that can make it very hard, even when Democrats win elections, to get enough done to fulfill the promises that their candidates make. So this is, to me, it's not, we're not necessarily at the end of democracy. The curtain has not come down. There are, if we are in a recession in 2026, I think Democrats' chances will be very good of retaking at least one house of Congress. And, let's see what happens over the next several years. There have been moments like this in the past, when it seemed as though things were all going one way. But, the pendulum still does swing in America, and I think it will swing again.
Patience and perspective are sometimes very difficult to cultivate, especially nowadays. But I take your point. And again, the book is American Contradiction, and I cannot think of a better book that I've ever read on post-war American politics. So I highly recommend it. And Paul Starr, thank you so much for talking with me today.
Okay, thank you, Mike.
Thanks for listening to this Politics Guys interview. If you have a question or comment for us, we'd love to hear from you. You can reach us at mail@politicsguys.com. If you're not already a supporter of the show, we hope you'll consider becoming one. Supporters get ad-free versions of everything we release, our full-length midweek episode instead of just a preview, and access to our Politics Guys Discord group. It's a fun place with a great bunch of people. You can support us on Patreon, where you can even sign up for a free trial. And if Patreon isn't your thing, or you're a current supporter and want to give us a little extra one-shot contribution, you can support us on PayPal and Venmo too. You'll find links to all our support options at politicsguys.com/support and in the show notes. If you'd like to get our full-length midweek episodes, but you're not in a position to financially support the podcast right now, just email me. I'm at mike@politicsguys.com, and I will be happy to get that set up for you. And whether you're a supporter or not, we'd appreciate it if you could subscribe, rate, and review us on whatever podcast app you use, as well as sharing episodes on social media. And finally, a very special thanks to our wonderful executive producers. They are Wilma Moreno, Daniel Toe, Ryan Beasley, Don Oglesby, Derek Schmidt, Dakota Heath, Jason Chrysler, Dave Dean, Jeremy Larson, Brian Matza, and Jody Marie Miller.
This podcast is part of the Democracy Group,